All right, so moving along now in Goethe's Faust Part 2. Before we get to this model here, I want to recap a second and flip back to the scene that we just looked at with the imperial residence throne room with the four different individuals, the chancellor and the quartermaster, the treasurer, and the marshal, all giving reports of the chaos that the kingdom is in, or the empire, I guess. This is supposed to be the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, although, as we have seen, Goethe has made him generic. But nonetheless, that does set it in the time of Charles V, who ascended the throne in 1519, while the historical Faust was still alive, just barely. I think his dates are... his dates were 1480 to 1540, so he was alive for a while longer, a couple of decades, while Charles was ruling. And now, so note then that the despair of the empire here at this point, as all these four different individuals relate this sort of Kali Yuga, that the empire is in shambles, there's no money, there's lawlessness, nobody's paying their debts, the economy is in ruins, all of this stuff that is equivalent to what's known as the wasteland motif, which requires renewal. And so this is meant then to link back to the opening of Faust, with Faust alone in his study at night, despairing. He is in a wasteland situation there, but it's typical of the differences between the two parts, that the first part is intimate. It takes place on the personal plane, whereas the second part is macrocosmic. Everything takes place on the outer plane of society and statesmanship and the states and all of that. But both begin in the same way, with a description of a psychological wasteland on the one hand, with Faust in the night scene at the beginning, and with a cultural wasteland here. So what has happened now? If we rewind back to the year 1500-ish, right in there, this is the time when the historical Faust was living. It's also the time when, as Goethe in his early 20s experienced his first creative explosion with the Urfaust, and then his first great play, Götz von Berlichingen, who also lived in the same time period and in the same place. And then a little bit later, in his later 20s, as he moved to Weimar, he wrote another medieval play called Egmont. So these are his three medieval works, and Egmont is set a little later in the 16th century. It's set during the Dutch War of Independence, which the beheading of Egmont, who's a historical character, was the powder keg that lit the 80 Years' War between the Dutch and the Spanish crown. And the Dutch did eventually achieve their independence, but it was a huge apocalyptic war that lasted all the way down to 1648, to the Treaty of Westphalia, between Catholics and Protestants. It was primarily a religious war, but it was political also. But the Dutch emerged victorious from that war. And so this is a period then of decay and disintegration in the West. This is the period 1500 when, so I want to look at this model here that provides an excellent model for what happens when the archetypes disintegrate. And here this is Erich Neumann's model in his essay Art and Time, from the anthology called Man and Time, edited by Joseph Campbell. And so here he draws up a model for cultural stability versus cultural collapse. And we've had these two great periods of cultural collapse right about the year 1500, and then again at the end of the 19th century with the lead into the world wars and the advent of modernity. So we've had these two major cultural collapses, and they both signify shifts, paradigm shifts, to use Thomas Kuhn's language, but they're cosmological shifts. So what Neumann does is here he's drawn a diagram of a stable order, let's say the medieval world order, which is fundamentally stable. And here you have the top half of this, to use Peter Sloterdijk's term, macrosphere. It's a cultural macrosphere. The top half is the collective consciousness, as Neumann calls it here, with stable archetypal values. These little bubbles here he calls archetypal values. And at the top here he labels this as the cultural canon of the time. I introduced the word iconotype in my book, Art After Metaphysics, to make a distinction between archetypes, which are collective, part of the human collective unconscious, and are therefore absolutely universal, such as the hero, such as the virgin birth, such as the idea of a holy power, and so forth. All cultures have that. But specific cultures in specific times and specific places have their own unique archetypes that inflect those universal archetypal energies through transitory values, as he's calling them here, which I call iconotypes. I think of the iconotypes that were reiterated over and over again all through medieval art, starting with all these the importation of all these Byzantine iconotypes, the Virgin Mary with the Christ child in her lap, the beheading of John the Baptist, the Annunciation to Mary, the Last Supper. They're reiterated over and over again until then, by the time we get to the cultural collapse, which takes place right around, basically during the Renaissance, as Neumann points out, and as also Rudolf Steiner points out, Faust has one foot in both worlds here in this cultural collapse. And so let's look at Neumann's diagram then of the collapse. We have here then what happens is that the archetypes right around 1500, throughout the 15th century, when depth perspective is mastered in painting, starting with Masaccio, leading all the way down to its apotheosis with Leonardo. And Leonardo takes those medieval iconotypes and apotheosizes them. And so that means that they are, his Last Supper cannot be beat. It is the best. His Annunciation cannot be beat. It is absolutely the best. And Michelangelo's vision of God on the Sistine ceiling, fixed forever in our mind's eye as Yahweh, as how we think of Yahweh, the bearded old cosmocrator. And the David statue is the apotheosis of that. There were many David statues before Michelangelo's, but no one ever topped Michelangelo's, and no one ever will. Once the iconotypes are apotheosized, they become semantically depleted at that point. Yes, Tintoretto paints a Last Supper. Yes, there are Baroque Last Suppers, but they're dying echoes and vestiges of worn-out iconotypes. And so we see here in the diagram of Neumann here, he's got disintegrating archetypes in the cultural collective consciousness at the top there, but new archetypes are surfacing from the bottom here, out of the collective unconscious, that announce themselves with the creation of the iconotype of depth perspective, which is really the iconotype of infinite space, that is later translated into mathematics as calculus, and becomes the ruling, governing archetype. Neumann says I think he's very sharp on this, where he says there's a shift from the heaven archetype of the medieval world order to now, with depth perspective and painting, and a new interest in the physical world, in the physical plane, we get the shift to the earth archetype and such phenomena as the invention of the still life, especially by the Dutch, the landscape painting also apotheosized by the Dutch, and then the portrait study. The interest in the individual as a metaphysical species unto himself is a new iconotype. So all these new iconotypes are emerging into being at this time in the late Renaissance. Meanwhile, of course, on the physical plane, then this spills out into the chaos and barbarity of the 80 Years' War between the Dutch and the Spanish that went on forever, 80 years. We think the world wars were long. This went on forever, nearly a century. So, and that spills out onto the physical plane. So that also a second collapse happens. We get stable iconotypes then that are reiterated from Leonardo to Manet. And then when we have the restructuring of Paris under Napoleon III, the Haussmannization of Paris, as it's called, completely restructured Paris, got rid of all the iconotypes that refer to biblical myths or Greco-Roman myths. Those are all gotten rid of. And perspectival space is also dismantled, starting with the paintings of Manet, whose painting 1863 Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe is the first to begin dismantling perspectival space into a perspectival space where each figure occupies his or her own space, and they're not all subordinated to the sense of sight. Now it's a different sense. It's almost the sense of touch. It's haptic. The eye unifies space visually, as McLuhan said, but the hand does not. The hand is discontinuous. And so Jean Gebser then comes in with the ever-present origin, and he talks about how this is the advent of, it looks like chaos, and unfortunately I think Neumann's essay is off here when he comes to describing modern art and he was pretty sophisticated about art, so I'm a bit surprised that he follows Jung's dogma of dismissing modern art as psychological illness, schizophrenia, all this chaos, broken forms and figures. Yeah, well, but you're missing the point, that this is all the manifestation of a single new unified consciousness, which Gebser called the integral or a-perspectival consciousness structure, of which all modern art is unified, at least down to World War II, with the idea of aperspectival space and the hyperdimensional object. That is to say, the object that is not perceived by the senses but can only be perceived with the mind's eye, because it exists in multiple spaces and multiple temporalities all simultaneously, as in the Cubist artwork of Picasso, let's say. So that's another cultural disintegration of a canon, and then the advent of a new canon of iconotypes that comes after it. And so what we're seeing here with the imperial residence is the description of a disintegrating society that's disintegrating. The medieval world order is in disintegration, and it's shifting into the Renaissance, the late Renaissance, and then eventually, ultimately, the Baroque, when everything stabilizes after the 80 Years' War, which ends in 1648. All right, so let's look at now this scene here, which is long. Spacious hall with adjacent apartments decorated and festively adorned for the carnival. And so now we have all of a sudden this carnival, and I'll just play the YouTube here with no sound of the carnival scene here in Peter Stein's excellent play. It's low res, and there's no subtitles to translate, but it's worth watching. So this is the herald here, he functions as the guide through this scene. He's kind of like a one-man chorus. And so it's a bit puzzling when you first read this. Why is he doing this? It reads chaotically at first glance. It seems like this endless procession. All of a sudden, before we really have any plot worked out, we get this endless procession of all these archetypal, mythological, and allegorical figures. But see, that's the point here. This is what happens when the collective unconscious is destabilized, and there is this age of the collapse of the cultural canon, as Neumann calls it. When that collapses, then the collective unconscious activates, and it floods us with archetypes. That's what's happening here. So the kingdom is now being flooded, or the empire is being flooded with archetypes, and we're going to see which ones are going to come out of the collective unconscious and stabilize. Think of the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch from 1500 from this period, which unleashes a whole flood of mythological monsters, demons, and spirits into the collective imaginary of the Germanic imagination. So that's what's happening here. That's one reason why we're getting this parade of mythological archetypes flooding the land, trying to fill in the semiotic vacancies left by the collapse of the medieval iconotypes. And also, but the other thing is that it's not random at all. It's very purposely organized. It's a disguised Platonic ladder of ascent, disguised as a carnival. And this carnival is supposed to take place on the day before Lent, which is the 6 weeks before Easter, which is a period of penitence and giving up things. You might quit smoking during that period, or whatever it is. It's ascetic and penitential. But here then we have the unleashing of the carnival, which the emperor has apparently picked up when he has gone down to be crowned by the Pope in Rome, and he's brought back the carnival here into Germany, or into the empire, and now they're celebrating licentiousness. This would have been a period perhaps in the medieval period of orgies and all kinds of letting free, a spendthrift idea, and hold that economic metaphor, because that's primarily what the scene is about. A spendthrift explosion of the archetypes. In other words, psychological coinage now that they're just spending in this opulence and luxury, because now they believe at this point, though this isn't clarified till the scene after the carnival, that Mephistopheles has saved the kingdom by introducing to them paper currency. The only thing is, the currency that would back up the paper currency has not been dug up yet out of the ground. And so all the nobles and courtiers are borrowing and spending recklessly against it with this paper money that they intend to pay back. Of course, that'll never happen because it causes runaway inflation and a total disaster. So that's what's happening. And so what happens in this carnival is a description then. Plutus, the god of wealth, shows up. It's actually Faust wearing the costume of Plutus, who shows up at the end with all of these metaphors about digging up gems and jewels and spending them, and it ends in a catastrophe on the stage with a fiery explosion of special effects that the emperor loves. And so here we have just seen, as the scene opens up, now we saw the herald announcing the flower girls who are here dancing, and it's not an accident that it starts with the flower girls. So what happens in this disguised Platonic ladder of ascent, is that it moves through the chain of being, from plants we've got the flower girls, to animals very briefly, just in one line really. And then it moves up from there into the human world, starting with the agrarian world, then into the world of the state, then eventually into the world of the mind and philosophy. That's the structure of this. So the sequence of characters here is deliberate, and it matters. There's nothing random about it. And so we get the flower girls who come in and sing all their flower songs. They're from Florence, named after Flora, the goddess of flowers. And then they are followed by a group of gardeners or farmers, men who then come in singing about their fruits for sale. So we're with both of these groups, we are at the bottom end of the chain of being with plants. And then briefly, a mother and daughter appear on page 150, just in a couple of stanzas, which is suggestive of Demeter and Persephone. So we're moving into the mythological realm of the archetypes at this point. The mother is, of course, Demeter, who is named Ceres, the goddess of grain, from which beer is made. And then Persephone, who comes out, she is the personification, as her daughter, she is the personification of grain itself. And then, of course, Dionysus will also be implied with the drunkard who comes out after them, the wine that's made from the grape of Dionysus. And then so immediately below the mother and daughter, it says here we have fishermen and bird catchers equipped with nets, rods, lime twigs, and other gear mingle with the pretty girls. So we move briefly here in one sentence into the world of animals, birds and fish. And then we start moving into human society with the woodcutters who come out and who represent, along with the gardeners, the agrarian peripheries of civilization. The farmers are always out on the peripheries. And then Pulcinella comes in, who is a harlequin, as the psychopomp. The harlequin is the guide down into the underworld. We're moving down into the collective unconscious here with this panoply of all of these mythological archetypes that are flooding the empire or flooding the court. And then we get these parasites that come in on page 151, who stand for social parasites, toadies, sycophants, and climbers, who are parasites on the state, whom Goethe had no respect for whatsoever. And then we get the toper, who is drunk, which represents Dionysian intoxication, the beer of Demeter and Persephone and the wine of Dionysus. He's drunk. And then we move up to another level of refined sophistication with the poets that Goethe has then come in, a satirist. He had intended to write a longer scene about different types of poetry. And then we move right into the mythological archetypes, properly speaking, with a series of trinities from the classical world. First, the three graces come out, Aglaia, Hegemony, and Euphrosyne. Normally, Hegemony is Talia. I'm not sure why he substituted Talia's name for Hegemony. But they come out, they sing a little song. They are followed by the Fates, the Parsi, Atropos, Clotho, and Lachesis. And Atropos and Clotho have, in the spirit perhaps of the drunken revelries of the carnival, changed roles. Atropos normally cuts the string, but here she's spinning with Clotho's thread, and Clotho normally spins the thread, but she has the shears of Atropos. And so they are personifications of a man's life, the Fates. And then they are followed by the Furies, straight out of the Oresteia, Alecto, Megira, and Tisiphone, or anger, envy, and vengeance. So we start getting the darker emotions, the more lower vibrational emotions start coming in here. Then the herald gives another announcement, and then we get fear and hope. Hope might as well be understood as desire. Hoping for an outcome is desiring a certain outcome, and fear of its failing or not happening. So these two kinetic emotions of fear and hope come out as allegorical personifications. And then with the allegorical character of intelligence, we move into the realm of the mind now and start moving up into, as we climb Plato's ladder, into the realm of philosophy. And we shift from the mythical consciousness structure of Jean Gebser to the mental consciousness structure that he says begins with the Greeks and the Hebrews and moves up from there. So intelligence says that two worst foes of man's existence, fear and hope in chains enslaved, I retain at prudent distance. All step back there, you are saved. So in other words, the mind, intelligence, should be capable of achieving a kind of Schopenhauerian aesthetic arrest that keeps the will at bay with its passions and desires, or fear and desire. With desire, you move toward an object. With fear, you move away from it. But intelligence is the thing for Goethe that is supposed to be brought in here to balance these two so that you're not just pushed around by them. And then Mephistopheles gives an appearance as Zoilothersites, who are classical characters who were skeptics. And he comes in, and the herald chases him off. And then in comes the procession with the boy charioteer. The boy charioteer comes in on a chariot pulled by 4 horses, which is, of course, now a reference to Plato's model of the soul, where he imagines that the soul has 3 components to it, the vegetative component and the appetitive component, and then the mind, or reason, that holds the reins of these 2 horses. And so that's what the boy is supposed to at first make you think of, but he actually represents the personification of the spirit of poetry. So, and then Goethe said in his conversation to Ackermann that the boy charioteer is meant to be the first appearance of the character Euphorion, who will appear later as the son of Faust and Helen of Troy. They have a son who is Euphorion, who will then plunge to his death. He'll try to fly and plunge to his death. So it represents those types of poets who self-destruct, which Goethe was definitely not that type. And so the boy charioteer comes in, and then he begins talking about squandering wealth. He starts introducing the idea of wealth. I am profusion, he says, I am poetry, the poet who fulfills himself by squandering his inmost wealth. I too am rich beyond all measure, count myself Plutus-like in treasure. I quicken and adorn his feast by lavishing what he has least. And so we have a couple of coinages here. On the one hand, we have he's referring to, and what this whole last part of the Carnival is referring to the treasure that Mephistopheles has proposed that they dig up, and in the meantime put in paper currency, but it will turn out to be spent recklessly and gone through, and it will cause a destabilization in the empire, complete chaos. And on the other hand, we're talking about psychological currency here. The poet's job is to create signifiers that are sort of spent or squandered as a kind of psychological currency, a psychological overflow. And so this is what he's talking about. And then behind him on the chariot is Plutus, which is the Greek god of wealth, not Pluto, although the reference, I think, Goethe does want you to think of Pluto, the lord of the underworld, because it's down in the earth that they're going to have to dig up the gold, or try to anyway. And so to think of the model where we have the collapsed cultural canon with the collapse, at least temporarily, of iconotypes that are in a process of flux and shifting, and as again it happened in the 20th century with the shift into modernity, where we have money then comes in sort of to fill the semiotic vacancy left by stable, functioning iconotypes. Then we get money taking on almost a kind of numinous aura to try to fill that semiotic vacancy. Money on the one hand and then war on the other are what fill the semiotic vacancies left behind by the collapse of a Sloterdijkian macrosphere, let's say. And so that's what that's the sort of allegorical process here that Goethe is writing about. The whole Carnival is foreshadowing the disaster that is about to happen to the empire with Mephistopheles introducing paper currency. And then, so the boy charioteer on page 162 also mentions Pentecost. He says, the greatest gifts at my command, see, I have spread with lavish hand. On this or that one's head there flare the flamelets that I scattered there. From one onto the next it skips, on this one rests, from that one slips, but seldom glares an upward rush to glow in sudden transient flush. On many, unaware of it, it sadly gusts as soon as lit. And so there's a veiled reference here to Pentecost, with the descent by the Holy Spirit to the apostles in tongues of flame, which confer on them all the different languages so that they can spread the gospel. And so this is what poetry does. It confers tongues of flame on the human species so that it can use the word logos, to put it in the terms of Heidegger, to where man is the shepherd of being because he has language that enables him to build worlds, world horizons. So there's that aspect of it too. So the currency means poetic language on the one hand, as well as the fake currency of Mephistopheles. And then so Plutus finally appears, which is Faust now. Note that Faust's first appearance in the play is a disguised mythological character, Plutus, the god of wealth. So he comes in behind him here, and then Mephistopheles puts in another appearance in another costume as Greed, and he comes in. Plutus is throwing all this gold and gems around that the audience thinks is real. They're dumb enough to think it's real, and they're scrambling after it. But Mephisto comes in and then melts all the gold together to create a giant phallus. And then he uses this phallus to scare all the ladies off. On the one hand, it refers to the fauns and satyrs that are about to appear, who are always ithyphallic, but also to Dionysus, who was also an ithyphallic god. But on the other hand, it's a kind of disguised joke of because Mephisto screws the kingdom, the empire, with fake currency. So there's that. And then fauns and satyrs show up. They're ithyphallic. Fauns are Roman. Satyrs are Greek. And then gnomes, which are Germanic characters who inhabit mines, just like the dwarves do in Tolkien. They're associated with mining. And so already we're moving into the idea of the mining that will be necessary to dig the gold up out of the land. And then giants, which are also from German myth, from the Harz Mountains, where the Brocken is located. And then a deputation of gnomes to the great god Pan. And Pan here is the emperor wearing the costume of Pan. But there's also a subtle reference to the fact that another cultural collapse happens with that Plutarch describes, and about the time of Tiberius, 14 AD or so, with a sailor who is sailing past an island, and he hears from that island somebody yell out, "The great god Pan is dead." And Nietzsche, of course, was referring to that when he announced in the Gay Science in the 19th century that God is dead. In other words, that's a cultural collapse. That's the collapse of a cultural canon, to put it in Neumann's terms, or to put it in Peter Sloterdijk's terms. That's the collapse of a macrosphere, which then unleashes and activates a flood of images from out of the collective unconscious. And we've been experiencing that flood all through the 20th century in our case, just as Europe experienced it through the 16th century in their case. And then, so the scene finally ends with Plutus coming forward, Plutus Faust coming forward, and ends up lighting a big fire. It's a fake fire. It's a special effects fire that dissolves everything and is a foreshadowing of the disaster that will happen to the emperor as Mephistopheles and Faust, with their various schemes, destabilize it even further. All right, so we'll leave it there for that chapter.